California traffic on his way to work. So the impetus of the project was in collaboration between myself and John Flowers, and we were actually directed to Jessica Heybach through Eli Kramer when we approached him with an idea about this as well. And he said he'd run a similar issue with IDOS, and then said, but it would be a really great fit for education and culture. Now, John is a much stronger Dewey scholar than I am, and I come from Southern Illinois University and the Dewey Center, so I kind of look at all other Dewey scholars as very, very strong scholars. So doing something like this was immediately intimidating because all I had to do was look at my colleagues and say, well, Eric is a really great Dewey scholar, or, Tschaepe and, everyone else. So everyone who I saw submitting, to the journal, I was like, yes, absolutely. I am in awe of the point of view that these people brought to the work. And of course, as many of us know, philosophy and technology in the works of John Dewey, especially through the works of Professor Larry Hickman, is not new territory, but technology being fast moving and increasingly fast moving, and coupled with the development of the field, what is roughly known as data ethics, and sometimes is broken out into smaller subsects, some people focusing on AI ethics and some people focusing on some other minutia area of it, moves so incredibly fast, and yet I kept finding that a return to Dewey constantly addresses all of these problems in various different ways. I am in the fortunate position of having the title of online coordinator at my university, and being somewhat cynical, I thought that as soon as I got that position that the internet would not be useful in 5 years. That was in 2018. And then of course the pandemic happened, and my job became increasingly valuable. And during the pandemic, that we started seeing so many assumptions made about technology and things that can be done during such a disruptive time. And I was just bouncing the idea off of John that we needed to do something with Dewey and data ethics that would be fundamentally different from the typical philosophy of technology approaches that we've seen. And of course, with the emphasis being on education, my particular interest in this as being an online coordinator was both making online asynchronous classes for students, coupled with the realization of, well, quite frankly, how surveilled students were before the pandemic and how increasingly surveilled they were when all of a sudden everybody is required to be on Zoom sessions that may be recorded, uploaded, stored infinitely, and what have you. And of course, the educational challenges and hurdles that come with it, whether or not students have laptops, internet access, or if it even covers the variety of learning and educational experiences that they can handle through online platforms. But this has been my specific interest as an online coordinator whose specific job is to design online courses. And of course, I didn't want to front load a special issue journal article with my ideas. So the call for papers, I was very pleased to see submissions coming from many of the people that we see here, whether it's Bob or Eric or Tschaepe or whoever else that I'm missing at the spur of the moment. I really liked the perspective that Mark brought with his paper. I especially liked Eric's co-authored paper on Don't Just Google It, which is a topic that I have seen reimagined different times. And in every reimagining of such an argument, you can't not go to Dewey. And the way that topic gets addressed every time changes and updates because technology has been moving increasingly fast. If I can take a second to pause, I'd like to welcome John Flowers, who's made it here. I've just been going over the impetus for the special issue, and if you have anything that you'd like to add, John, I'd like to give you a second.
Sure. I think the publication of the special issue is increasingly timely, not just because of the past issues of datafication in education and their relationship to democracy, but because it can provide a ground for other pragmatist scholars to build upon as they engage with the increasing complexities of datafication, algorithmic platforms, and other forms of artificial intelligence as they are further implicated in both education and democracy in an increasingly digital world.
And because one of the ways that I personally conceptualize data ethics is a very broad, vast field. I actually teach a course on it where I cover areas such as privacy, surveillance, and security. And then we move into intelligent technology, which includes algorithms, algorithmic bias, robots and autonomous vehicles, and then social media, biomedical data, political data, and things like that. So my idea of data ethics as it relates to Dewey and online education and pedagogy, they all sort of interlock and overlap at a university setting. So if you have students doing an online asynchronous class, a hybrid class, a Zoom class, or what have you, there are certain sacrifices to privacy. There's a certain amount of surveillance going on. There's a certain amount of algorithms, attention economy, and all of these other things intersect. And it was actually John who pointed out to me that universities are one of the most highly surveilled places in the United States. And with that idea in mind is actually one of the reasons why I wrote the paper the way that I did and that special issue.
Similarly, similarly, my approach to data ethics draws heavily on Dewey's experimentalism, and I take seriously Dewey's admonition in human nature and conduct that increases in technology have thrown together cultures in ways for which they are not prepared for, which is to say that they have not developed the appropriate cultural habits of transaction with one another through technology. And so like Kevin, my approach to data ethics is grounded solidly in Dewey's own vision of democracy and vision of experimentalism, wherein ethics is something that we do over time.
And to sort of return back to Jessica's point at the beginning, this was all done before ChatGPT and AI became a problem. And we saw how quickly that accelerated. A rough timeline in my memory was it was basically released and the panic alarm started going off in November. And then in December, people started saying, okay, well, we have AI detection software. And then when the semester started again in the spring, in January and February, people were saying, okay, well, maybe it's not that big of an issue, but we're getting a lot of false positives on this AI detection software. And just recently, I've been reading articles that 99% of this AI detection software is completely unreliable. And Jess, you sent us an article about some of this, which was an amazing read. And I wish this was a topic that we could have covered in the special issue as well.
Yeah, I again want to echo what Kevin and Jonathan have laid out. I think it's a really dynamic there's 3 issues, set of articles. The authors that are on today are kind of giving you a sample. Some of the questions afterwards, we'll be asking them, is their thinking been updated as a result of sort of the new material conditions that we find ourselves in? So with time in mind, I'm going to turn it over to the authors. The order, I'll just, if you scroll up in the chat, it is Eric, Bob, John, Mark, and then Natalie and Lance. And so we'll go ahead and start with Eric. I will gently keep track of time and use the chat to badger folks. So I will hopefully we can get us all in. So Eric, I turn it over to you.
Sounds good. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here and for organizing this panel and as well as the papers. It was a really fun sort of opportunity. The origin of the paper that was included that I co-authored with some graduate students is actually my philosophy of education course here at the University of Kentucky. I teach in the College of Education. Excuse me. And my class was talking about Dewey and participation versus spectation, right? And one of my students raised her hand and asked, but, when a student just Googles something in class, is that participation? And because a lot of people sort of want students to put their computers down or their cell phones down and think and participate, right? And yet, of course, one of the things students will do is that they may be on their phone doing irrelevant stuff, but they may also be wondering about what it is you're talking about and do a Google search, right? And there are those really opposed to the incorporation of these kinds of tools in that kind of setting. We do want to think about things like ethics and how, what the expectations are communicatively in a given environment. And, there are reasons to pick that form versus another form. And, at the same time, there's lots of criticisms that people raise about students depending on things like Google. But obviously there are opportunities with which people can do exciting things with these sorts of tools. And my thought for you about the subject matter of AI in the big picture at this point is essentially akin to what we'd say about Google or other developments we've had in the past, which is that there are ways of doing things that are deeply troubling, and there's also ways of using tools that are enhancing and enriching. And so that's not sort of surprising, but I think what you want to do is to think about what makes the difference, what makes it a good use of a given tool or a troubling one. We also, of course, want to think about the risks to certain people, because charging forward with new technologies, as Jonathan was pointing out, obviously can have consequences that can be troubling for a number of different kinds of populations, including vulnerable populations. And so, I think there's tools in the scholars and humanistic resources that we study for thinking about these things. I mean, they don't have to be mind-blowingly new for them to nevertheless be fresh and useful again, right? And so, for instance, if you're thinking about like, how do we get a sense of what we should be worried about with these new technologies? I think that's part of what's so scary, right? There's a reason we want certainty, when we want stability. We're afraid of what might come when we don't know the consequences of what we're doing. And at the same time, the language that may be familiar to all of us, perhaps, or many, is, that comes to mind from Dewey, is the notion of a dramatic rehearsal. When you think about, putting on an event or some form of activity, well, there's all kinds of things you can anticipate, and you anticipate those on the basis of how similar forms of events or things have happened in the past. When calculators were introduced in schools, people thought kids will never learn math anymore because they can just have a watch on which they punch buttons, and they don't have to learn how to add and subtract anymore. We had similar sorts of questions, and now we're getting this in terms of, oh, well, kids won't be able to learn to write anymore because they'll just use these tools. And so these aren't new so much, right? We can use notions of dramatic rehearsal and sort of think about the things that have been problems in the past, but at the same time, there will be new problems that we're not ready for, or very likely are to be, especially with the powerful tools that we've got emerging now. When it comes to thinking about things like whether it's Googling something or using AI, one of the things good instructors are going to do is to sort of think with people about what it is we're getting, how it is we're asking for something, what it is we're trying to do, what it is we in fact get. So you've got many stages of possible thinking. The interpretation is on the back end that I was talking about. Of course, interpretation goes in the formation of what it is you're going to do your search about, or what it is you're going to ask AI about, and so forth. And so just using such tools isn't obviously inherently problematic. Of course, how you use them is and will be. And so I think looking to Dewey in terms of this very simple notion, and I acknowledge that this idea isn't new about participation and spectator, but when it comes to Googling, the question at the end of the day is whether using a tool like that shuts down inquiry or enables greater participation. So thinking about the ways in which the former can happen, for instance, when someone treats a text as equivalent to any other text, we all know that there's obviously varieties in the kinds of usefulness and credibility of different sources, right? And so those kinds of things are part of what needs to be taught with regard to our new tools. I probably am running out of time. But a further thought I have for you, kind of for next steps of research and thinking. Oh, I have a little bit more time than I thought. Well, anyway, a further thought I have for you about next steps of research and thinking is perhaps in the potential to expand what is already being done in a number of institutions, in particular in higher ed institutions, in research offices, but also in research agencies generally that get public support. And of course, I'm thinking about internal review boards, right? And when people are going to do research, or when they're going to develop certain practices that can have ill consequences for some people, well, we should have some process of review by some group, even if it's internal to an organization, but where the governance of that review process is somehow independent, that then considers what are the potential consequences and worries for a variety of different potential communities that could be stakeholders, and how do we make sure that we're engaging in the most responsible practices that we can. So my point is simply the notion of perhaps advocating for certain kinds of standards of professional review in the technological development community. We've got kind of traditions and practices where a group of different companies had a standard that they came up with together somehow, right? That then governed how, let's say, compact discs used to be made, or whatever. But that's not ethical, right? That's about how the systems are going to work and then talk to each other. We can think, though, about the propagation, which has begun a little bit, but could be done more, of obviously ethics committees, review committees, and the expectation of that on the part of technology companies has been largely pretty low. And when they have hired someone, they often haven't really listened to that person. But the notion that it be a person is obviously a mistake. It needs to be a community. It needs to be a group. And that's what we do in universities. We're already facing these sorts of things. We could raise cause for expectations that are much more substantial for the technological community developing these tools to engage in dramatic rehearsal, to write principles for the ethical conduct or treatment of human subjects affected by technology. We have precedents to draw on and potentially apply moving forward, and I think these are important things for us to be advocating for. When it comes to educational tools relating to our paper, I want to make sure that when we're engaging with students and we're understanding that they're going to have access to them, of things like Google and AI, I want them to have a sense of what it means to use such tools in ways that enhance their powers and their participation in the intended activity, and rather than finding things that sort of essentially cut that short, right? And so discovery tools are useful, but also teaching people how to use the tools in meaningful ways might get you the meaningful participation without as much of the surveillance frame and mindset. So this is just one set of thoughts that are preliminary. I'm not a great scholar of AI, but I am watching and listening and thinking. And I do see a connection where people are always worried about this new tool, but we've seen that before, and we can try and learn from how that has progressed in the past and apply our lessons to rehearse dramatically what things we should be worried about, and also be ready to account for and redress the problems that come from the new technological development that we couldn't foresee. So I think that's my time, but
Yes.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this with you all.
Okay, great. Yeah, and Eric's article, along with two grad students whose names are not in the chat, who, Eric, you might want to give their names, but the title is Don't Just Google It, Dewey and Perspectives on Participatory Learning with Online Tools. And yeah, maybe add their names. I apologize for leaving them off. So next up is Bob Coulter from Widgets to Wizards, Pedagogy for the Scoreboard Society. And we got to say, we loved your title, by the way.
Oh, great, thanks. So Bob Coulter, Director of Litzinger Road Ecology Center. It's a field site managed by Missouri Botanical Garden, and spend a good bit of my time working directly with teachers and kids on a variety of projects, both tech-enabled and otherwise. The underlying metaphors there in the title, I'm glad you enjoyed it. That was coincidental. I was reading Howard Gardner's autobiography about that time, and he had a reference that he was specifically for graduate students, that the ones who do a widgety sort of thing, they get just the right number of publications and the right conference, they get a job relatively quickly, but the ones that really go on to make a difference aren't those fit the mold, be a widget sort of thing, but ones that are interested in breaking new ground, creating new opportunities, new metaphors, hence the Widgets to Wizards. And then pretty early in the paper, I also built off of Alison Gopnik's metaphors around being a gardener or carpenter, and raised the question, are we cultivating the students, or are we building them to spec? Which, as we know, schools do a great job of building kids to spec. You will have mastered these skills on this timeline and have this score, and your teacher will be about all that stuff that is pretty well known among us. And so trying to reframe the environment, how do we think about where the technology fits? How do we move past what used to be a big buzzword, drill and kill software, master skills, quick kind of things, and use them to reframe the groundwork more in a Deweyan sort of experience and growth, habit development, pieces that aren't worth rehashing in a crowd that's pretty comfortable with it. But what does that look like if we change the parameters, change the assumptions, frameworks that we're after? Excuse me, I killed the radio. Life at an outdoor center, the radios are on all the time. So again, the doing, trying, and undergoing sort of thing, building, rebuilding, responding, learning from the experience versus do the exercise, what did I get? What's my grade kind of thing? And that feeds into the scoreboard society. We rank and sort everybody. I'm not sure where I am on the current scoreboard among presenters, but but that's the worldview. And using the Deweyan frame around enlisting intelligent action toward a goal, and a goal that the students at least had a hand in developing individually or jointly with their students versus what do I have to do? The last year that I was a full-time teacher, I tried to have the kids develop a project, and that is very hard in a school where they're not used to it. And actually had a student break down crying. Remember, the framework here is find something you're interested in. After a couple days, she broke down crying. She couldn't figure out what I wanted her to be interested in. And that was in third grade. She'd already internalized the school model pretty well. And so now I'm spending a lot of time with computer modeling tools that were developed with the teacher ed program at MIT. We had a hand in developing aspects of that and using ArcGIS and geospatial tools with kids. Ultimately, we're an ecology center. The funding for my position relates to that. And so finding ways to engage kids with the community. Again, not just quick learn it. Oh, we use the tool. Aren't we 21st century learners? We use technology. Aren't we special kind of thing? But I just finished a series of pilot testing with kids around watersheds and using the tools to really anchor yourself in place. Get out, explore your community, explore your neighborhood. Where does the water flow away from us? Where does it come toward us? What water is being brought into us? And that's both generically interesting just to be able to read the terrain, understand what's happening, but it also opens the doors to a lot of environmental justice considerations. Metro St. Louis is consistently ranked as one of the most socioeconomically and racially divided communities in the country. And so, those are interesting things to raise with kids. But it's also just a way to engage kids with nature. Mentoring a couple of kids for the Esri map contest that they're investigating box turtles. St. Louis University has a project tracking box turtles with radio telemetry. And these were kids in a camp I ran last summer. They're converting their work into a project for the Esri map contest, looking at, is there a difference between males and females and what their area, what their terrain is. And we have data from two different locations, one that's relatively flat, closer to the river, and another that's back in the foothills of the Ozarks. Does terrain make a difference? And this is a project that the kids developed off of their previous camp experience. And I would argue these kids are a lot closer toward that self-directed learner, owning the process, framing questions, framing their own way to collect data, using me and their parents as effective mentors, without being just the checkbox. Yep, we use GIS, we use data, etc. Toward the end of the paper there, I touch on things that I have just a little bit of reading on. I will defer to anybody with some expertise in it. But the neuroplasticity builds off of Dewey and ideas of plasticity that he guessed 100 years ahead of time on it. Extended mind, Andy Clark and others. How does the technology extend the mind, not just be a substitute for thinking? Building off of Eric's piece around Google it, look it up, or use a calculator, calculate it for you. Ask AI, it'll tell you what you need. And and some pieces that I was just reading a bit on around epigenetics, our life experiences and such that influence how different genes are expressed. So I think there's a lot of potential there for a revitalized look at experience in these contexts, again, around the neuroplasticity, extended mind, and epigenetics that would easily be a paper or book unto themselves. And I'll leave it there. Look forward to the discussion.
All right. Thank you, Bob. Next up is John. John, say your last name for me before I butcher it.
Machielsen, but you can say Michaelsen. I do it all the time when I'm,
when you're with us Americans.
Yeah, don't worry.
All right. Your paper is titled Responsible Imagineering, John Dewey's Pluralistic Ethics and Technological Innovation. So I'll turn it over to John.
Yeah, thank you. Before I start, great work, by the way, on the editing overall for Jess and Kevin and Jonathan, and lucky to be a part of it. I really liked the previous speakers, so I'm looking forward to Mark and Natalie and Lance as well, and the discussion. So I'm an educator myself. I work in Tilburg in the Netherlands at the Fontes Academy for the Creative Economy, and we teach marketing and business bachelor students. And we teach them, one of the methods that we use is a concepting methodology. So we train them specifically for the creative industries. So think TV, radio, media, gaming, all kinds of, event, music, all kinds of industries like that. These concepting methodologies, I'm not a concepting expert, my colleagues are. I'm an ethicist. But what I found by talking with these students and working with them on like their master papers and stuff like that, is that they sort of have no ethical starting point with these concepting methodologies, and then all these concepts sort of need to be fun, sort of from a hedonistic point of view only, right? They need to be fun, engaging, and the point where ethics came into all these concepts that they realized for all kinds of businesses was at the end, right? When you had sort of like problems where you would get angry customers, or you get, I don't know, some sort of marketing campaign that had some troubling racial issues, like wrong kind of language used, wrong kind of imagery used. And the minute it started to become an image problem for a company, that was when ethics came in the terms of accountability, right? Where you, as part of the concept you created, you thought about accountability. And I found it, coming from a Deweyan perspective, really amazing that at the end of a sort of creative process, you start thinking about, okay, but what could go wrong? Or when something goes wrong, we should take responsibility. And in the paper, I talk first about all kinds of other things, sort of several preliminaries about, terms like experience and the moral deliberation in the situation. I consider these all known with the people present here. But where I go is to see, okay, how can we sort of dissect this concepting methodology that we use in our school, and how can I start improving on that by in fact getting all kinds of other methods in there to see, can we change this conception of ethics that's in this methodology, and instead of a sort of backward looking account where at the end of a process you think, okay, this went wrong, let's be accountable, how can you sort of reframe or rethink that, reconstruct it, where you would have ethics at the start. I discuss all kinds of things about technology in the paper as well, but I think given the fact that all the other papers are more technology oriented, that's not the biggest uptake from my paper. I'd say the biggest uptake is that if you've got creativity in a school setting, and you teach people creative things, that you should lead with ethics as well. You cannot import sort of responsibility at the end of a process or at the end of a creative concept, and you should lead them during the process and make them reflect on it. And one of the things that I've done since writing the paper is actually doing experiments in my school. So working with colleagues who are concepting teachers, because basically I'm discussing their work, right, in the paper. I'm sort of criticizing them for not being critical enough. And I've had some really intense discussions in my university. But after we had that, we sort of came to an agreement like, okay, but let's then test it and see whether through testing and through iterations, we can improve it, right? Because in that way, you work not on better concepts, not just on the outcome of what we train students to do, but also on, during this process, working on better habits for these students. So yeah, I don't know how I am for time, Jess.
You have a couple more minutes if you want it, or it's up to.
Yeah, but I mean, that's sort of where I'm at with the research at the moment.
Okay.
So yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. So we'll turn to Mark Tschaepe. His article, Data Without Democracy, The Cruel Optimism of Education, Technology, and Assessment.
So thanks for inviting me to this. I've had to go back and sort of revisit this paper. It's been, a while since I wrote it. It was, it's funny, I was looking at the conclusion, and I guess I had finished this up in February of 2021. And I knew that because in the conclusion, I actually mentioned that I was dealing with the Texas freeze at the time, which was sort of part of what I brought into the paper with regard to issues of technology and digital assessment or educational assessment using digitization. It's been, I guess I've sort of gone in different directions since then. I did a follow-up paper that was for a Hickman conference, sort of a fest trip for him that came out in Contemporary Pragmatism that sort of followed up on the paper. I think at this time I was just beginning talks with Ford, and they were needing somebody who had done work with technology to do research on automated cars or automated automobiles, at self-driving vehicles and issues with regard to discrimination. And so that was a project that I'm still on with Georgia Tech and Prairie View, where I am. So that sort of has influenced my thinking since then. But what I can say about going back through the paper is that there's a lot here that really came out of my aversion to assessment more generally. And it's kind of funny that we're having this now, because even earlier this week, I was in a meeting where I got into an argument with our faculty kind of representative of assessment. And that was sort of the basis of this paper, is the kind of policing that I feel is done with assessment, and this very sort of top-down approach that's done that negates experience usually of the faculty members and the students. And I find that most assessment is based in a mistrust of faculty and students. And there's this idea that we have to have these sort of tools from the outside, if you will, that are going to improve our teaching methods, whatever that means, and improve our learning objectives, whatever those are, and improves our aims and all of these other filler words. And the only sense that I get when I'm dealing with people who are really into assessment, who have drank the Kool-Aid, is that they have gotten to go to a lot of conferences where they've gotten a lot of swag, and they come back and they're really excited, and they feel as though all of us should do that work too. And I'm like, yeah, I don't really see this, doing much for my students or me. This seems like a process of monitoring, or to go back to Kevin's term, surveilling, right? That this is this is surveillance. There's a lot of surveillance on university campuses, and this is just another way to do it. And when I wrote this piece, digitization was really becoming a much more popular form, or a much more popular set of tools with regard to assessment. So the term or phrase data mining was coming up a lot. When I wrote this, I had just finished a piece on sort of the transition to scopic mediation for classes. So this was when COVID hit, and most of us were, if we were teaching, we were doing it like this. We were doing it through some scopic medium. And with that, I started looking more into how digitization was actually affecting assessment and what people were doing with it. And I was really struck by the use of things like digital dashboards, and what counted as data. And I would actually go to conferences that were education conferences, and people would talk about data in this naturalized way. Like the data is just out there. Like we're not actually constructing the data. And so in this piece, I thought it was important to indicate that data is always constructed. It's not just something to be found. Since then, I've done a lot more work on normativity and hegemony, and that comes up briefly in the paper when I mention the problems that I find with assessment and difference, and that's probably the best way to put it. So Eric had mentioned vulnerable populations, and I would say that most of my work now really focuses on what might be categorized very broadly construed as vulnerable populations, as well as my kind of constant attack against essentialism. And so I would say that now my work has a lot more to do with how these kinds of tools are often used, not necessarily intentionally, but almost in a microaggressive way, to impose things like heteronormativity within classrooms, or ableism within classrooms, or sexism or misogynoir within classrooms. That, as Eric said, the technology is neither good nor bad inherently. It's how we use it. But I think oftentimes there's not this critical assessment wherein we're actually analyzing what gets brought in with the technology, what these assumptions are that are then imposed upon faculty and students and the community at large.
All right. All right. Thanks, Mark. We'll go to our last set of presenters, Natalie Schelling and Lance Mason. Their article was titled Data-Driven Decision-Making in Dewey's Science of Education.
Thanks. I'll kick us off. So I clearly am the black sheep here as an assessment and data person. So our paper stemmed from work that I've done on teachers' use of assessment data, and particularly elementary teachers. So our particular paper looked at qualitative data from focus groups I did with teachers. And interestingly, we made the connection between what the teachers that I talked to said and, you know, Dewey's conception of research and, you know, teaching practice, which is obviously Lance's area of expertise, not mine. But we found some interesting distinctions in the way that teachers conceptualize their use of data and their practices. So in particular, I looked at their attitudes about using data. And so I think consistent with what Dewey said, teachers were really more interested in the data that they collected from their own assessments, which, you know, has the ability to be much more reflexive and representative of what teachers are doing with their actual students. So they made a clear distinction with that kind of what we call classroom assessment, being really useful in helping them plan instruction and best meet their students' needs in the classroom. In contrast, they, it's at least not to my surprise, probably not many people's surprise, they had very little positive to say about standardized assessment. And so mostly they felt that the pressure from them or on them from standardized assessment was largely negative, you know, that because there's sort of this top-down approach with standardized assessment where, you know, whoever at you know, ETS or whatever testing company is setting the content for an exam, and then they're expected to use it with their unique students in their classroom, that there was really very little applicability to that data. And connected to that, you know, our teachers sort of made a distinction between the culture of data use within their schools and how that impacted them. And so in particular, they talked about the difference in how administrators emphasize data and the purposes of data. So again, consistent, I think, with Dewey's ideas, that the teachers felt a big difference between, on the one hand, principals in particular who were supportive of their own assessment use and data use. So they distinguished between administrators who really viewed assessment data as, you know, an opportunity to further help students to look at the results and tailor instruction, versus, you know, in a lot of schools we know, unfortunately, principals, administrators, and parents are just interested in getting the positive results, right? Like whatever it takes to get that. And so teachers from both realms sort of recognized the difference between having that support versus sort of an attitude where they had to kind of defend the results that they received. So, you know, like, your students didn't do well on the state assessment, like own up to what we see and prove to us why this happened and what's going on, versus a principal who would say, okay, so your students didn't meet this objective, like what can we do as a school to brainstorm and problem solve to help them meet or address that gap. And then connected to that, a big factor that the teachers discussed as being critical was having autonomy within their use of data and assessment, right? So that, you know, if I as a teacher am able to set my own objectives, measure them with assessment the way that makes sense to me, and then use the data in meaningful ways that reflect my pedagogy and my students' unique needs, that's very helpful. But again, when I'm receiving data from, you know, whoever on high at the testing company or the state, that really is not totally connected and definitely doesn't represent my students, there's a much less sense of autonomy and sort of this, you know, it's like they're being forced to use that rather than choosing to do it for their own sake. So I think we noticed some, again, connections between, you know, Dewey's philosophy and what teachers are experiencing right now in the moment. So again, my realm is data, so I will turn it over to Lance for analysis based on Dewey's philosophy.
So what I did was I took the study that Natalie conducted on data-driven decision-making, and I aligned it with how Dewey felt about the scientific method, and I used mainly his book, Sources of a Science of Education, which, as far as I can, you know, Dewey's written 1 million books, but as far as I can tell, it's his most, you know, consistent rumination on the scientific method. And so basically he gives a 3-part construct for science, and this is written back in the 19-teens, as far as I can tell. He wanted it to be epistemologically flexible, methodologically open-ended, and grounded in classroom practice. So just briefly on those, epistemologically flexible, you know, he was clear that against a positivistic use of science, right? Mirroring or mimicking the physical sciences for human endeavors, because, you know, humans are just far too complex to do that. That's obviously an old argument at this point. Interesting to know that it's over 100 years old, though, and was going on by Dewey, but way back then. For the methodologically open-ended, for Dewey, he felt like, science, and this, is pretty solid here. That science needed to be continuous, open-ended, tentative, right? We may be able to take action on a particular conclusion, but that conclusion always needs to continuously be revisited. So, an obvious corollary to this is the research has to be qualitative, not just quantitative, right? We're not just looking for numbers, but, we need a more kind of expansive science to take all that in. And lastly, maybe most importantly of his concepts here is the grounded in actual classroom practice. And a lot of what Natalie talked about there gets into how much teachers valued conducting the research, being able to contextualize the research for their own ends, as opposed to having it imposed on them from without. That's very consistent with Dewey's vision of what a science should be, right? Should be grounded in the actual context. Dewey was wary of universal conclusions or universal rules of application of science, right? That there's a very kind of tentative and cautious view here of what we can do with science, and to have humility as we conduct it, and recognize that there's never going to be a final answer or final conclusion to practice or to anything else. Just saying a little more about that. I mean, he says the final arbiter in research between the researcher and the teacher should be the classroom teacher. What we wrote in the paper here is such a teacher may not have found a recipe for improved practice, but rather will have improved insights and sharpened attunement to issues pertaining to the education of their students. So again, a lot of humility here in what science can achieve, but a much more kind of loose and open-ended version than obviously what we deal with today with the standardization movement and everything. So I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you both. And Natalie, your comment about being the black sheep, I just want to say, I think what's great about Dewey and this community is that we're from all different kind of corners. And so what I think is the strength of Ed and Culture and the John Dewey Society is that it puts us in conversation with people that we might not otherwise be in conversation with in other kind of professional organizations and groups. And so I think one of the strengths of this theme issue, but really Ed and Culture overall, is just the diversity of authors, contexts and backgrounds. And so we're all black sheeps, or there are no black sheeps in this community. So thank you all for your really quick overviews of your articles. I want to kind of pause and see if there's questions from everyone before Jonathan, Kevin, and I maybe lob some questions. But are there follow-up questions, thoughts anyone has that's on the call? No? Okay. Kevin or Jonathan, do you have anything you'd like to start with?
Yeah, I could lob I don't know if it's gonna be exactly a softball, but in Science and Social Control, Dewey says that many of the results of science haven't proceeded from the intrinsic nature of science, but from the pecuniary aims that have organized science prior to anything like the machine or the scientific method existing. And in that piece, Dewey identifies these pecuniary aims as roughly aligned with finance capitalism that is extending enormously the power of landed gentry and various kinds of financial interests to organize the lived experience of essentially their employees. In this context, I was curious to ask our authors, in what ways what kinds of interest do they see organizing the particular technologies that are at issue in their pieces, and whether or not these interests are aligned with Dewey's vision of democracy, Dewey's visions of education, Dewey's visions of human flourishing. like I said, not exactly a softball. So,
Well, I can jump in a little bit. I'm not going to foreground technology in what I'm saying, but certainly we can foreground Bill Gates and we can tie him into tech pretty easily, right? But we know the Gates Foundation created the Common Core standards that most states have adopted. Other states have kind of copied and sort of pseudo adopted by, adopting sister-like standards. Right. And the regimes that are being imposed are very pecuniary, right? As you're saying, as Dewey pointed out, right? The Walton Foundation and all these other groups that are pouring hundreds of millions of dollars in to try to privatize education. This is all being done to turn education into a profit sector of the economy, right? And it just so happens a lot of these folks, again, like Gates, are, on the forefront of new technologies, on the forefront of a lot of our social policies too, that are pecuniary in nature, right? I mean, we're living in a neoliberal era where, it's profit uber alles, right? I mean, that's where we are. And, I know our paper there was, trying to use Dewey to bring a little reason to what science could be. But of course, we're a drop in the ocean, unfortunately.
Coming from a different perspective, in the gap, the school district that I happen to be sitting in right now, where the ecology center is, uber affluent school district, and all their promotional stuff about how much their kids just love taking tests and showing what they know. They've totally, to the extent any of that's true, they've been totally co-opted by the system. Whereas a couple hours, I'm meeting with a group of 5 kids who just love to do project-based math. They're preparing for a regional competition, but all game-based play, the map contest project where they're self-chosen. I think that's a lot closer to kids flourishing more than just coming up at the top of the leaderboard kind of thing. And those are very hard to sustain in schools because the metrics are not there for enjoying math, finding it intriguing, or for designing your own studies. And so
I'd like to pick a few thoughts about what Jonathan brought up. Thank you for the difficult question. When you think about the recent developments with regard to artificial intelligence, so this is not necessarily about the paper, although it has relevance to Google and algorithms and so forth. Excuse me. So people are worried about how AI is going to sort of take over some things. Including especially intellectual things that people used to think were more secure than some others, right? That machines could do, right? And among those is legal guidance or advice and what have you. And my point about that is that among the things on which computer systems will draw to make their legal recommendations, well, is precedent. And of course, when you think about what precedent there is in the United States, the answer is that people with more money have greater power of representation and thus generally better outcomes in court. And what I mean by that is you can also associate those powers with, frankly, groups like white folks versus others that are more traditionally not as wealthy. And therefore, AI might generate advice for people and companies and so forth that you especially have to beware of hurting the white folks with money who might sue you. But these other folks, not as much has happened, which is sort of what happened in the Ford Pinto case, right? Oh, there's only going to be so many lawsuits. So if we lose some people, it hasn't been that much money. We might as well pay the lawsuits rather than fix the cars, right? So my point is that we may get algorithm somewhat, but also data-driven, seemingly objective recommendations from the law that we have to protect certain kinds of people more carefully than other kinds of people, which I think should be the subject of greater scrutiny and punishment on their part if they're trying to cover their asses rather than doing what's right. And so, sorry, it looks like David has a hand up.
I hate to interrupt a good point. I think you're making an excellent point, but I just was adding my 2 cents on a couple of the papers. I don't want to take things askew, but I'm really excited to read these issues. I have to admit I haven't read them yet, And it's so great to be hearing such nice summaries and examples from you all. I've been working on this a bit as well, and people are interested in this in all over the world. And I guess one thing that came to mind was that the two things. First is the thing that I'm interested in is really in part about inquiry and participation, but it's also about those really initial stages of inquiry and what it means to solve a problem. And in some ways, this is going to sound really elementary to everyone here, but I think it's sort of the rock that no one is turning over, at least outside of our folks, which is that, and I find this all the time when I talk to people in education in my school, which is that it is the sort of the blank canvas that the students begins to fill in themselves. It's the difficult space in the beginning of a problem where you're not just doing dramatic rehearsal, but you have to initially feel what the problem might be. You have to feel it, and you have to let your own imagination participate in the possible dramatic rehearsal, and then eventually the possible inquiry. So I don't want to talk too long, but the point is that the initial phases of inquiry require a certain kind of attention, which is autonomous, which is what an attention economy, a click-driven economy, a data-driven economy disallows increasingly. So, you know, I guess the point I try to make to people in, at least at my school, about AI and technology is that we need to be very careful, particularly with students just starting college who maybe they're first-time college students. We have to be very careful in whether or not, and this gets back to Eric, your question, which is we need to ask what the tools are doing, how they're being used, and also to Mark's point about how it's sort of serving neoliberal ends or not. But I think we have to look very carefully and tread very gently with how students are, how their experience is shaped at the very earliest moments of question formation and meaning formation, because it's this really early, almost a pre-articulate primary experience phase of experience that is where all technologies that we are now dealing with, AI and clickbait and all that stuff, that's what's getting sped up. That's what's getting capitalized and collected and aggregated and then fed back to us to gain a tighter control. But that is exactly the phase of greatest interest to educators if they want to give students and adult learners and whoever else autonomy over the process that would lead to dramatic rehearsal, that would lead to inquiry, that would lead eventually to science. And that's my comment.
All right, Barb.
I just want to emphasize, I think, what David is saying. As I was listening to all the presentations, I was thinking two things. One is everybody seems to be saying, look, folks, there's nothing magic about these tools. These are tools, and there are all the questions that have to be asked about this tool as there are about any other tool. And I very much appreciate that point. The second piece is that it's so clear that the theory of educational action that motivates everybody who's talking, including possibly you, Natalie, although I don't know you that well, but there's a theory of educational action that Dewey offers that is not the same as the theory of educational action that is governing school policy and has been governing school policy for at least 20 years, and I would say probably more like 40 or 50. And that theory of action is about fixing teachers so they can fix kids. Dewey, of course, and this is where I think I'm emphasizing what David was saying. Dewey, of course, isn't talking about that at all. So it feels to me like for us to even talk about some of these issues, we have to make it very clear, and I think David was saying this too, to get back to those moments of initial engagement, get back to those moments of attention and understand that there's a completely different theory of action going on. And I think Natalie and Lance's teachers are trying to drag that back. I think that's what they're saying. No, we want that autonomy. We want to use our data from our quote authentic assessments, I mean, you call it whatever you want to, that show us what kids can actually do, and then we'll respond to that. And I want to highlight John's notion of responsibility, because I think he's dead right, and I'm trying to say the same thing. That's it.
Thanks, Lance.
Yeah, well, I wanted to push back a little bit on some of the stuff that was said respectfully. I don't, want to start a, a Zoom fist fight or anything. But there was the technology is not good or bad or whatever. And Larry Hickman was mentioned, and to me, Hickman, I love Hickman. He doesn't always do a good job with this. I look to a philosopher of technology like Feinberg, and I'm not going to quote him here. I can't remember exactly who said this stuff, right? But technology has a vector. It's created for a purpose, and so it's created with an intention that biases it, right, or however you want to put it. Just thinking about our research in relation to AI, the bias here is, again, and David got into some of this, I think, as well, with what he said, but it gets us away from context. Right? If you're starting to use AI, let's say teachers are using it to plan lesson plans, this kind of gets into, I think, what David was saying about the initial inquiry and all that. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but the idea then, if they're using AI to help plan their lessons instead of going in like our research showed here, and the teachers working with the students and bringing the questions out from there, I think you have a real diminishing of the potential of education, right? I mean, this plays right into the hands of the standardizers, of the pecuniary interests we mentioned earlier. This technology, I don't see this being used for good. I understand it could be used in helpful ways, but I think it's very, very dangerous here, and I think we should be aware of that as educators.
All right, Kurt.
Yeah, I can be really quick. I think Langdon Winter is another philosopher of technology who makes kind of a similar point about, he's not a determinist, but it's like, since the technologies are made with certain purposes in mind, they tend to move us in a certain direction, or they suggest certain ways of being, or something along those lines. So it's not that it has to be. And I really like that there's a tension between the kind of, I don't know, the kind of Deweyan idea that tools are just tools, and the idea that tools are just tools, but they might make us, Langdon Winter says, a chapter, one of his chapters in his book is, do artifacts have politics? And his answer is kind of, yeah, they kind of do. And he's got really great examples to explain why that is. And so I like the tension between these two, because there's worth in both of those points of view. The idea that, like, we shouldn't get, like, I think the way Barb said it, I forgot how exactly, it was like, there's nothing magic about these tools, right? Like that, and that's right. And that's right. But at the same time, one of the examples he gives is that, like, talking about, like, the way we do energy, that nuclear energy moves us toward centralization and a kind of defense military mentality in some ways that solar doesn't necessarily. It doesn't mean that it has to lead us that way necessarily, but it sets us up in that direction. Or the advent of the automobile, makes all the stuff outside of your car a field of obstacles to avoid, that puts us in the world differently. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to live our lives a certain way, but it makes it more likely, or something like that. So anyway, I like the tension between those two, and trying to do some work to figure out, like, if there's a productive tension that can lead to something good coming from considering both those angles. Thanks.
Okay, Jonathan is next.
Yeah, but something interesting that we might think about where technology is concerned for Dewey is that technologies are relative to their environmental contexts, e.g., right, a specific culture develops in response or in transaction with an environment, and in doing so develops a specific technology that extends the capacities of that culture within their environment, which is why Dewey says that, the things that we would take to be the material sciences, including the computing sciences, are part of the material aspects of culture, which are in transaction with the ideal aspects of culture, our aims, our beliefs, our religions, our ethics, to give rise to even our economic systems, to give rise to the purposes to which technology is put. So it's not the case that Dewey says that a tool is a tool and it is neutral. And I think Larry Hickman and I might butt heads about this, but a tool is always culturally situated, has a purpose determined in advance for it by the cultural situation, by the habits, by the collective body of habits that are the culture's customs, and thus shape the environments in which are thus shape and are shaped by the environments in which the tool is deployed. So for Dewey, I don't think Dewey would be surprised that the assessment industrial complex has radically reshaped the ways that K through 12 education has been delivered, right? Nor would he be surprised that the assessment industrial complex is increasingly being used to reorient higher education towards a sort of business profit model, right? So one of the things that I wanted to just throw out here is that I don't read in Dewey any view that a tool, a piece of technology, is neutral. It's always influenced, organized, and organizing the contexts in which it is deployed. Langdon Winter, as a last thing, I think the more crucial point about Langdon Winter for our conversation is the ways that he describes Bob Moses's project with Lower Manhattan, right? The structuring of the overpasses such that buses could not travel under them, which denied access to many of the green spaces in Lower Manhattan to anybody who was, Black or brown or could not afford a car at the time, right? And this is similar to the ways that some of the surveillance technologies and the increasing datafication of education lock out or deny access to education by or for folks who do not have, say, high-speed internet.
Just to give you all a little bit about format, we're going to go to 2:30. So I'm going to just go in the order in which hands were raised, but just so you know where we're trying to end, although I think we could probably stay on all afternoon and keep talking about this. So Eric was next. You're muted.
Of course, I'm muted. So there's no doubt that technology, in terms of particular developments, can be designed in deeply problematic ways and have a certain kind of intent. The question is, could not many of those things be taken up and used in entirely different ways? And I think they can be. And just, one of the things that I think is very easy to sort of succumb to is a cynicism that, like, I'm just an individual. I'm kind of upset that Apple makes a phone where the battery stops working, or works worse at a certain point, so I buy the next one. I can be upset about that. But what did we just hear about the notion of businesses and when they actually care about ethics is when they don't look so good. And one of the things philosophers are good at teaching is how to criticize stuff, right? And so writing for the newspaper, writing for the public, and using the online platforms to like using Facebook to criticize Facebook, using these other things, right? That wasn't how it was intended, but it certainly can amplify the voices of individuals to raise these kinds of problems and make a big corporation look bad that eventually may only pay lip service, but some of them, if that only comes out to be lip service, it even looks worse. So we can keep pressing as a result. And I agree that some things are only symbolic solutions, but there are significant changes that happen as a result of individuals using some of these technological tools to raise concerns and criticisms. And that's where I think philosophers have a lot to offer.
Bob.
Just a quick add-on for several pieces of this thread around whether technologies are neutral. I'm wondering if our models of school give an easy off-ramp to more simplistic, more datafied, more scoreboardy uses of technology, that it rewards using the technology. Oh yeah, I'm doing GIS, that's good. We graph data, that's good. And it puts more on the teacher ultimately to inoculate against that easy out, the easy answer. Yes, I did that, and really ground it in the kind of pedagogy that we're talking about today. Both the depth of inquiry, the social justice angles, et cetera. But you really have to push past, I think, the easy answers there that modern, contemporary schooling creates for it. Not an easy task, and it's a lot to ask for a teacher when a lot of their reward structure pushes against it. But I'd argue that's an essential part of this equation.
Okay, David.
Yeah, I appreciate the comments that just came. I don't see Dewey as being technology as neutral guy at all. I mean, you can look in the public and its problems, and you can look in even some of the early education stuff where he's talking about the influence of information. He talks about, students are not empty curio cabinets to be filled with information. That's a technological point. So I'm not really that worried about it. I like Feenberg and Langdon Winter in part because they're much more willing to go to the social political background to the technologies which are at work and which I think deserve to be called out. So I'm on board with sort of the comments I've heard so far. The only point I'd want to add would be that what I was saying before about the early phases of experiences being something that we could emphasize more is I think there's something of a political program or a rhetorical statement in that, which is that there's a relationship that teachers and students have, which is still in a way their own. And I think it's that space which is still sort of not been permeated by administrators and technologies and so forth, although they're trying to. So I think that in some ways, the point I was trying to make about autonomy and experience, especially at the earliest phases about relationships between individuals, that's the space in which some of the pushback, some of the political and social pushback against the misuse of technologies, which is being rightly called out in this conversation, I think that's where some of the evidence and argument can come for a rhetorical pushback on technologies that are doing what we would say are the wrong things or pursuing the wrong values in education.
All right, Mark.
So the first thing is that, I mean, saying technology is neutral is kind of shorthand for what Larry was saying. And I think we have to look at the context in which he was saying it, which is he's arguing against this essentialist notion of technology as a thing in and of itself, right? He's not trying to negate this idea that technology is within a set of social habits that is going to accord it value and is going to determine biases and whatnot. So that I have to get out there just to clear the air, because Larry's not making any comment about technology, and I'm not making any comment, and I doubt very much that Eric's making any comment about technology being neutral and apart from social context. But it is important to look at what Larry was arguing against, especially in the first book on John Dewey and technology, and then in the PTTC book, where he's kind of continuing that with regard to sort of trying to get us away from this essentialist notion of technology. The second thing I wanted to bring up was kind of piggybacking off of David's point about felt difficulty, which I think is really important to make, is that what I find is that in examinations of tools with regard to education, often what is forgotten is qualitative experience. And there is this idea that we can evaluate and determine what the problem is or what the problems are without an examination of the actual felt difficulties. And this is what I really have a problem with, is the imposition of what is often stated as a difficulty from those outside of the experience. Acting as though, well, if we implement these tools, we'll be able to find out what the difficulty is. But what's ultimately undermined is any sort of felt difficulty that the participants are enduring. And so that, I think, is a key point, especially when we're talking about those early stages of learning, is students really being aware, critically aware of the felt difficulties that they're undergoing, or as I would put it, the discomforts that they feel within the experience.
Yeah, I would want to add to that point, because I think my reaction or concerns around AI when I have two kids of my own in college, but in that sort of younger cohort of group of kids, adults, that are going to AI because the felt difficulties of writing and reading and learning they can't withstand the difficulties, that they just jump to AI, they dump it in cloud, they get a summary of the journal article and spit it out to their teacher. And it has been pushing me back to Dewey's How We Think, because I think we are losing something around, or we have a compromised situation around the quality of thought. And I'm going to put in the chat this article that I came across recently and shared it with Kevin and Jonathan. But in this article, the author talks about we might want to consider there needs to be a new category of thought. So she's analyzing syllabus policies around AI. And so there's the surveillance side, there's, all the things we all know. But then she argues, are we moving towards actually needing a category of what is original thought, and how thought that is not within partnership with machines or technology, how that's going to be seen as sort of, again, just an entirely new category. So yeah, I think this is some interesting questions around those felt difficulties, the sort of the origins, the birth of how we really think through things that are difficult. And when we can go somewhere and get easy answers, what's going to happen? And I might not be a very optimistic bird at this point. So I seem to be more concerned than not at the tool we've created. So Kevin, did you want to lob? We have a couple more minutes. I think you had a question too for the group.
Well, it's sort of connected with a few of the things that some people have already been talking about, sort of the data mining, data-driven education, things like that. One of the forerunners to, philosophy of technology has been Luciano Floridi, who is somebody whose work I actually wrestled with for quite a while and did not like at first. And it was another pragmatist who turned me around on it, Colin Koopman, giving me some really nice background on some of Floridi's work and, gave me some more respect for him. And between him and Shannon Valor and a few other people, you sort of see them beginning to articulate what data ethics is. And of course, I'm seeing all of this through this Deweyan pragmatism lens. I also like to bring some, Buddhist skillful means or some Confucian pedagogy with, some of the things that I pull into these things. And one of the things that Luciano Floridi brings up when he talks about data mining, for example, is that the future of education or the future of this particular technology is not going to be big data, but small data. That is, what we have right now is too much data online, scraping too much data without any curation of what we have. So we're getting increasingly more garbage in, garbage out online. And I think that we are sort of in the throes of that right now of this sort of problem. And I sort of wonder if anyone has thought about this in terms of smaller, more carefully curated bits of data. And because of my Asian philosophy background, I think of this idea in terms of translation. You are probably all familiar with the DIKW pyramid, the data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And that to get from one level to the next, you're basically doing translation, or at least you're interpreting some of this information. And what I see as a problem right now with something like ChatGPT is that it's a people-pleasing generative AI, and it will lie to you no matter what. It is just trying to give you information that makes you happy and that you like, which makes it an interesting tool to use in the classroom, because if you show students how ChatGPT gets things wrong, it serves as a tool for critical inquiry and reflection. Okay, so that's not a very cohesive question, and I've been very poor throughout my life at coming up with a simple, straightforward question. So how about thoughts?
Sure. I think we had Jonathan and then John have their hands raised.
Oh, sure. I'm just going to be real brief about that. I had actually something for Mark's point, right? I think teaching students to navigate the felt tensions they experience in the learning process could avoid some students using our primarily quantitative evaluative structures as ways to express their frustrations with faculty, and thus generating particular kinds of problems. But to add on to something that Kevin says, garbage in, garbage out. A couple of scholars of technology that I'm in conversation with have been thinking about the ways that AI generated information should be labeled as a form of data pollution, insofar as the dearth of like AI generated nonsense is flooding the internet, which makes any kind of research that much harder, which as educators who have to increasingly teach students research skills in an increasingly online world, that makes our job all that much harder, because we not only have to teach them how to research, we have to teach them the distinction between ostensibly data pollution and a credible source.
All right, John, I think you're going to have the last comment. No pressure.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off something Jonathan just said. Like this felt difficulty. What I find, we do a multidisciplinary project in our last year of the bachelor. It's one of the courses where I'm sort of testing my theories, right, and putting them into practice and see whether we can come up with better methods. What I found there is that there are two bachelor's types of students there who have a different degree, and the mainly guys that focus on data and technology in their marketing courses, they have enormous problems sort of engaging with this felt difficulty, right? Whenever they have it, they sort of come to a standstill. They're not engaged in learning anymore. They sort of zone out and want to go away, basically. Whereas we've got trend research students who are engaged in like all kinds of fake signal recognition, you know, far more experientially trained students. They're far more open in this course. So it's anecdotal. I haven't tested it yet, but I found it relevant. So I think, and in context to what Kevin said about the small data, we've started moving away from assessment tools the last year, because we found the same problems as I heard everybody tell. So concerning small data, what I see as small data is just giving students feedback on their work in the moment, within that situation that they're working on it together, and just sitting there and asking questions and observing and engaging with them and letting them internalize that feedback. And then at the end, sure, they need to provide something because we're not there yet where, you know, there still needs to be something handed in, something delivered that needs to be graded. But we've moved away, luckily, from sort of this weekly or almost daily system filling with data points that are senseless. Nobody's looking at them anymore. So I want to add that as a positive note.
All right. Thank you, everyone. So yeah, I think this is a really important and clearly rich conversation, and want to thank everyone for coming today. Thank you to the authors who were able to write during COVID. So I think you're part of a small group that stayed productive during a really difficult time. So thank you for all your work, Kevin and Jonathan. It was a grind, and you did a really nice job with the theme issue. Round of applause to everyone. Thank you. That's what I hate about these calls. There's no audio for these moments. But I also want to introduce again Kathy and Kurt, who will be taking over the journal. I look forward to, I think, what will be some exciting future issues with them at the helm. So thank you both for taking it over. And I look forward to seeing what happens next. And so I'll turn it back to Barb.
Thanks so much, Jess. I just want to make a bit more of this moment, thanking Kurt and Kathy. they became a package deal somewhere along the line. I'm not sure exactly how that happened, but I can't tell you how happy I am about it. And I want to invite them to tell us a little bit about what we can expect from Education and Culture going forward. They are now handling new submissions. If today's discussion is any indicator, things will be good for the journal. I would encourage all of you to both continue to submit, and to let your friends know to get in touch with Kathy and Kurt and negotiate what's possible there. Kurt, Kathy, what can we expect?
Well, thanks, Barb. Hadn't prepared a speech, but I will say thanks to Jess for her service to the journal and the society. We're excited to take the baton and keep it moving forward. We'll have, we're not ready to roll out like our exciting new initiatives because we want to get the lay of the land a little bit and see what's up. But we are rolling. There are submissions coming in. Want to say thanks to everybody who's read, published in, reviewed for, and otherwise supported the journal. And say keep on submitting, and please be ready to say yes when we ask you to perform the labor of love that is reviewing. Because remember that, I don't want to browbeat everybody, but like this stuff only works if everybody pitches in and gets that stuff done. And definitely tell your friends to submit and keep on submitting too. So for now, that's all I've got. I don't know if Kathy wants to add anything else.
No, I think what you said is great. I just really appreciate your work, Jess. And it's not easy to run a journal, as you know, and especially not in this climate when I know personally I've gotten 5 requests for reviews just this month alone. And I know why, because I usually say yes. And if you say yes, then you just get inundated with them. And so
don't say that. You're going to convince people not to say yes.
No, but I think we're considering various ideas, like, other journals maybe having a editorial board that people are on for a couple of years, and you're expected to review a couple times a year based on that. But we don't want to change anything that's working. Jess's issues are still just about coming out. And so give us a couple months before we kind of fully understand what's going on, get our first issue out. And then I think we'll be excited about any kind of suggestions for special issues or ideas like this. I think this worked great. Like, I think it's just the right amount of people. People were interested in getting together, doing this a little bit more often, making it voluntary, maybe, for a couple of the issues or maybe all the issues, who knows? But so we are definitely open to ideas. So feel free to reach out to Kurt and I if you have any ideas or anything that seems like totally out of the box you want to try with the journal, just let us know. We'll give it the college try if we can.
Okay. Jess, thank you. Everybody, Kevin, Jonathan, all the authors. Good discussion. We could be here a while, that's for sure.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. We'll see you. I hope to see some of you in Portugal.
Or in Salt Lake.
Or in Salt Lake for PES. Yep, that's right. Or SAP in Boston at the end of the month, end of March. Okay. Take care, all.
Great, thanks.
Take care.
John, you're already on our list now.
Okay, good.
You're on our list. So
okay.
And it's you already know what to do, but we can tell you to put you on the list.
We'll talk on this.
Yeah.
Thank you. We
These
appreciate
people
it.
are quick on the uptake, John. They're not letting you escape.
And now we got you. You got you on there.
See you in Portugal, Barb.
Okay, great, John.
Bye.
Take care,
everyone. I'll see both of you in Portugal.
Take care.
Okay.
Oh, good to know. Good to know.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
All right. Hey, Chip, are you still on there? All right. I'm going to end the call. I do have something. Take care, Chani. Good to see you.